On September 11, 2001, terrorists hijacked 4 planes. They ran one plane into each of the Twin Towers, the World Trade Centers, one into the Pentagon, and heroes aboard the last hijacked plane crashed it before the hijackers could use it for a terrorist attack. This was a horrific terrorist attack on American soil. Or at least that's the story they want you to believe. But what if that's not the true story at all? What if the hijacked planes are just a cover up for what really happened on that day? Follow me down the rabbit hole about 9/11. Hello, friends, and welcome back to The Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Dani, and today we are talking about 9/11. But before we get into that, because, it's going to be a lot, I just wanted you all to know that I'm still giving away stickers for reviews, ratings. If you leave me a rating or review wherever you're listening, just take a screenshot, send it to me via Instagram, and I will send you a sticker. And if you want to share our podcast out on your social medias, please, please, please do. I would love that. I'll send you a free t-shirt, which I think they're really cool, but, I'm biased because I designed them. So, send me that. Also, just go ahead and send me a screenshot of that, because sometimes I don't see if it's been shared or whatever. So tag us, but send me a screenshot also via Instagram, and then I will send you a t-shirt. So that helps us out, helps us keep putting out more episodes for you. And this one is a doozy. There is so much that goes into 9/11. This is going to be a multi-episode conspiracy theory, because today I'm literally only touching on the Twin Towers. I'm not touching on Building 7. I'm not touching on United 93, the Pentagon, none of that. Or all the things that came out of this terrorist attack. I'm not touching on any of that. I'm literally just giving you the facts about 9/11 and a little bit of the history, I guess, and the timeline. I am giving you the timeline, so that will include everything. But mostly just the Twin Towers today. And there will be a episode to follow that will cover all the other things. And if I have to do a third episode, so be it. Because there's so much information and I want to give you all of it. Also, I don't want to connect the dots for you. I'm going to leave kind of a lot of things maybe unanswered, and you can kind of connect the dots yourself, because it's more fun that way. But also, we're all skeptics here. That's why we listen to this episode, to the show. So it's up to you to come up with your own opinion, I guess, as to what you think happened. I'm not going to tell you what I think happened. I'm just going to give you the information that I have found out there for you. So let's go ahead and start with a little bit of history about the Twin Towers. Like I said, I'm not doing everything today. I'm just doing the Twin Towers, so I'm going to focus mostly on them. So construction started in 1966 and finished in 1970 for World Trade Center 1 and 1971 for World Trade Center 2. And these were the tallest buildings. In 1972, these were the tallest buildings in the world. But in 1973, the Sears Tower in Chicago was completed, and that became the new tallest building in the world. And now I'm pretty sure that there's some building in Dubai that's the tallest. I don't know for sure. I didn't look that up, but, just background knowledge, I'm pretty sure that's what happened. Is now Dubai was like, we could do better, and they built something really tall. Originally, the Twin Towers were developed by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, but in July of 2001, Larry Silverstein of Silverstein Properties bought a lease from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey for the buildings, both buildings, for 99 years. And he bought that lease for $3.2 billion. And fun fact, Silverstein was actually the developer for the new World Trade Center building in New York after these ones collapsed, and we have that one new building. He developed that one. And there is a fun little Silverstein story at the end, so I'll, remember his name because, conspiracies. So let's go over the timeline of the day. So on the morning of September 11th, 2001, 19 terrorists armed with box cutters and knives boarded planes on America's East Coast headed toward California. They wanted transcontinental flights because they wanted the fuel tanks to be basically all the way full. They didn't want, like, if it was going just from, like, New York to, I don't know the East Coast very well, Maine, they're pretty close, there wouldn't be so much fuel. So if they were going from New York to California, they're going to fill those tanks up. So that's exactly what they wanted. And so they picked a lot of flights that were going across the country. So at the time, TSA wasn't really a thing. And actually, TSA is one of the things that resulted from this. But because there wasn't TSA, there was still security, but it was easier to get things through. And so that's why they could sneak back, like, box cutters and knives, but they were small knives, past the security. And that's why they were armed with box cutters and knives. Because security was not as tight as it is now. You did not have to get to the airport 2 hours early because you basically walked right through. So let's go through the timeline here. So they got through security at 5 a.m. They were 5:45. They were at the plane, or they were at the airport. Flight 11, the first flight, that's the flight that hits first. That's the flight that goes into the North Tower, Tower 1. That takes off at 7:59. At 8:15, flight 175, which is the flight that hits the second tower, takes off. So just 15 minutes later. At 8:20, some of the crew members from Flight 11 were calling, they were calling basically, like, the ticket counter people at the airport, and they were trying to say, like, this is who I am. It was one of the flight attendants. She said, this is who I am. Some guys, I think we're getting hijacked. She, like, went through this whole thing, and they, like, didn't know what to do. They had no idea. They're like, who are you? Like, what flight are you on? Do you know, like, you know? And they kept asking all these questions. I listened to this whole transcript, and they didn't really know what to do. Did they call the police? Who did they call? They're very confused. At 8:20, Flight 77 takes off, and that is the flight that hit the Pentagon. At 8:24, on Flight 11 again, one of the hijackers actually transmits a message. I think they thought they were talking to the people on the plane, but they were actually talking to the tower. And the tower was like, what are you saying? Like, what? And what the guy said, it was Mohammed Atta. He said, we have some planes, just stay quiet and you will be okay. And he thought he was talking to all the people on the plane, but he was actually talking to the tower, so he just made, like, a little bit of a mistake, which happens, you know. So at 8:37, Boston Air Traffic Control actually alerts the military and was like, hey, like, something's wrong. Something's not going right. Because now they've had this weird transmission. They've had this flight attendant calling saying, hey, I think we've been hijacked. So far, nothing from Flight 175. Nobody has really called. Nothing weird has come from that plane. But Flight 11, people were like, something's wrong, right? And they were trying to contact the ground. And at 8:42, Flight 93 takes off. So now we have all 4 of our hijacked planes are in the air. 4 minutes later, at 8:46 a.m., the North Tower is hit by American Airlines Flight 11. This is a Boeing 767, and the plane, or the tower is hit between the floors 93 and 99, and there's 110 floors in each of these buildings. 77 passengers and 11 crew members on board and hundreds inside the building were killed instantly. So here's something that's really important. When this plane hit the North Tower, Tower 1, it cut off all 3 emergency stairwells and trapped hundreds of people basically above the 91st floor. So even though it hit the 93rd floor, 92 was also damaged, and because, fire. They couldn't get down the stairwells. And there's only 3 stairwells, emergency stairwells. All 3 of them were severed. So anybody that was on the 92nd floor or above was basically trapped there. It was terrifying. I remember when I was a kid and I watched this on TV. So, of course, first responders start mobilizing towards the North Tower. They're like, what the heck just happened? And honestly, at first, everyone thought, like, what a crazy accident this was. So 4 minutes later, at 8:50, the U.S. president is alerted. He was at an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida, reading a book to a bunch of elementary schoolers. He was informed that a small plane had hit the North Tower. And basically, like everyone else, thought it was just like such a crazy accident. Like, what the heck just happened? Because no one knew that, the flight attendant had been calling and there was this weird transmission. Nobody knew all that. So they didn't know what to do. They were just like, okay, I guess, try to save everyone you can. At 8:55, the South Tower declared secure. So they basically said no need to evacuate. Like, everything's good. No, there's no problems here. It was just a tragic accident. Don't panic. And some people decided, I'm going to leave anyway. But they made, an announcement over, I want to call it the 1MC because that's what we call it in the Navy. But basically, over the loudspeaker and said, hey, you're good. Actually, their exact words, the announcement made by the Port Authority fire safety employee said, quote, your attention please, ladies and gentlemen. Building 2 is secure. There is no need to evacuate Building 2. If you are in the midst of evacuation, you may use the re-entry doors and the elevators to return to your office. Repeat, Building 2 is secure. So at this point, they had no idea what was coming. Which, how would they, And then just a few minutes later, they actually do the police department, the Port Authority Police Department decides, we actually should go ahead and evacuate. So they were told not to evacuate, then they were told to evacuate. They're very confused. Anyway, at 9 o'clock, we start getting phone calls from Flight 175, because remember, up until this point, 175 didn't know what was happening. They didn't know that they were being hijacked. Well, we have a voicemail from a guy named Brian. It says, quote, Jules, this is Brian. Listen, I'm on an airplane. It's been hijacked. So they knew something was happening. They started trying to call their loved ones, starting to call people. That was at 9 o'clock. And at 9:03, the plane actually hit the tower. So, and remember, they did start evacuating South Tower, but they had maybe 10 minutes. And that's a lot of stories to get in 10 minutes to get that many people out. That's a lot. It's a lot of people. The South Tower, Tower 2, was hit between the floors 77 and 85, killing 51 passengers and 9 crew members on board the aircraft. It was also a Boeing 767. And they didn't know at the time how many people had actually been killed from those floors because they had started evacuating. But, again, they cut off access to 2 of the 3 emergency stairwells, so there was still 1 stairwell. Luckily, South Tower still had 1 stairwell, but they cut the cables for the elevator cars. And because there was so much up and down, they're like, okay, don't evacuate. Okay, do evacuate. And everyone was kind of a little panicked because the North Tower just got hit. Then there were a lot of people in the elevators. So when they severed those cables, some of the cars just fell, which that's sad just thinking about. But some of the cars were suspended, but they couldn't get the people out of them. So they were just suspended with people in them, and there was no access to them. Again, first responders are trying to respond, and they were going to try to get the people out of the elevator cars. They were going to try to get all the people evacuated, try to get these fires under control, because what the heck is going on? Now both the Twin Towers have just been hit by airplanes. The president was informed basically right away, was like, hey, the second tower has been hit. And then the members of his staff suggested that they leave the elementary school, and at 9:35 they drove to the airport and boarded Air Force One, and it departed from the airport at 9:54, So, I mean, they did pre-flight in 20 minutes, which is impressive. And they didn't really have a clear destination. The president wanted to go back to Washington, D.C., but now they're like, well, I mean, we don't really know, like, what if our country's under attack, like, what the heck is going on? And so they decided to go to a local Air Force, or it wasn't local-ish. I mean, Louisiana's right next to Florida. They went to an Air Force base in Louisiana just for, like, a secure landing location as they tried to figure out, like, what to do. On board Flight 77, flight attendants are calling, like, a flight attendant, Renee A. May, what a fun name, calls her mother and tells her that the hijackers have seized control of the plane and they're forcing crew members and, like, passengers basically to the back. And then, of course, they're disconnected. A couple minutes later, a passenger, Barbara Olson, called her husband, who was a U.S. Solicitor General, and he was at his desk at the Department of Justice. So that kind of was lucky, maybe. And she told him that hijackers had taken over the flight with knives and box cutters. And Theodore Olson, so the U.S. Department General husband, he alerts other federal officials. It was like, hey, there's another plane that's also been hijacked. Vice President Dick Cheney was still at the White House, and so he was evacuated to a secure location underneath the White House because they were basically under the impression that now our country's under attack, there are more planes that are being hijacked, something crazy is going on, and they wanted to, start securing as many top officials as possible. There is, in my show notes, I'm going to share this timeline. It is actually very detailed, and it has a lot of information, a lot of videos, pictures, transcripts. You can actually hear people on the phone talking to other people, like the flight attendant from Flight 11. You can actually hear the phone call between her and the ticket counter people at the airport. So it's really extensive, but it's so much good information. If you're really interested in it, I'll share that. At 9:37 a.m., the Pentagon was hit by American Airlines Flight 77. 53 passengers and 6 crew members on board all died. So finally, after all these hijacked planes, all this stuff, at 9:42 a.m., the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, grounds all the planes. This sounds like a good idea, except, it's a good idea, don't get me wrong. It sounds like an easy thing. Okay, planes land, just be done with it. But it's harder than that. All the planes that are low on fuel need to land first. There's a lot of planes up in the air. Wherever they're at, you're grounding all of the planes, which is kind of it's kind of a big deal. And so these are a lot of planes that, and it's already basically a work of art to get these planes landed in the certain time that they're supposed to land. And so it's more tricky than it sounds.
Did you know that over 40% of Americans have a hard time swallowing pills? So when it's time to take your vitamins, large capsules and pills are out of the question. We know that gummy vitamins exist, but they're full of sugar, they get stuck in your teeth, and they only contain a fraction of the nutrients you need. Luckily, Easy Melts has discovered the ultimate vitamin sweet spot. Vitamins that melt in your mouth, taste like a treat, and are packed with nutrients ready for absorption, all without an ounce of sugar. For a limited time, Easy Melts is giving listeners a free 3-month supply of vitamin D3 with their first purchase. To claim your free D3 vitamins, visit try.easymelts.com/spring24. That's melts.com/spring24. Say goodbye to the old way of taking your vitamins and say hello to the easy way. Menopausal and perimenopausal women, listen up. It's time to take control of your health and comfort, and Winona is here to help. Winona is a telemedicine company for menopause care who believes that your symptoms are real, important, and deserve to be taken seriously. And for many women, this starts with hormone replacement therapy. Winona's HRT is made with plant-based, bioidentical hormones rather than synthetic ones, so it better aligns with your body to offer relief from hot flashes, weight gain, and other uncomfortable symptoms. 80% of women who use Winona find relief within just 90 days. So, what are you waiting for? Get started today. Visit buywinona.com today to start your free visit. With free shipping and the ability to pause or cancel at any time, your path to wellness has zero obligations. Use code SPRING24 at buywinona.com for 25% off your first treatment plan. That's BYWINONA.com for 25% off. Winona, menopause care made easy.
At 9:45, Washington, D.C. evacuates. And at 9:58, so at 10 o'clock, 911 calls from Flight 93 are going out. So a lot of people, 37 telephone calls, are known to have been made from hijacked Flight 93. Most were placed from the rear of the plane, so they would use the little phone that used to be on the back of all the plane, or of all the seats. There used to be a phone back there, and you could swipe your little credit card, dial a number, and call. And I mean, some cell phones worked, and so they could use their cell phones too. And they called 911. But they decided, and if you've ever watched the movie, they decided that this hijacked plane is not going to go wherever it's planned to go. So they took over and they crashed the plane. I can't even imagine making that decision. And there were unaccompanied minors on that plane. But they didn't crash it yet, but at 9:58, they were making phone calls to 911 and to their loved ones. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. It burned for 56 minutes, and then it collapsed in 10 seconds. And we're going to get into all of that, but it did not burn for very long. At 10:03, Flight 93 crashed. At 10:15, the Pentagon E-ring collapsed, so the damaged section of the Pentagon collapsed. At 10:28, the North Tower collapsed, and it had burned for 102 minutes. And at 11 o'clock, the New York City mayor basically orders like a total evacuation of all of Lower Manhattan. I mean, they didn't know what to do. And at 12:15, U.S. airspace is closed. And then basically the rest of the day, and it goes through like the rest of the day, it has different things. But the rest of the day is just basically like first responders working to try to rescue as many people, as many survivors as they can try to find. Everyone's just like working as hard as they can. And at 5:20 p.m., World Trade Center Building 7 collapsed. It had burned for hours. It was a 47-story tower, but it had already been evacuated, so there were no casualties. At 8:30 p.m., the U.S. president addresses the nation from the White House, because he returned to the White House. So it was a day. And I remember that day, because my parents never picked me up early from school, ever. They never picked me up. And I remember my sister and I, we had the news on, which we didn't typically do. We had the news on. We were watching the Today Show. And we watched the towers, because one of the towers was already hit. So that's why they had the camera on it. And then we watched the second tower get hit. And then we went to school. And when we were at school, we watched the towers collapse, because all the teachers had it on all the TVs, because they were curious about what's going on. And then a couple hours later, not long, maybe an hour, maybe two, my parents came and picked us up. And we were like, why are you coming to pick us up? I was young. I was 7. I think I was in first grade, second grade. And my mom said, it's just a day to be together. I don't know why I remember it so clearly. I was like, I don't understand, but all right, cool, here we are. So it was very scary. There's a whole generation of people now that never even witnessed it, don't even know, like, the trauma that, I was young, but I still remember it. But my 2 younger sisters, they probably don't even remember it. I mean, they were 5 and 3. Oh, yeah, they definitely don't remember. But at 7, I was just about to turn 7. So it was pretty traumatic it's a big ordeal. So after all this, of course, the world basically wants to know What happened? I mean, obviously we know what happened. We saw the planes go into the buildings. We witnessed it. But why did they collapse? Like, what the heck happened? So in 2002, FEMA put out a report on what they think happened. And then in 2005, INST, so the National Institute of Standards and Technology, came out with a report that was similar but different than the FEMA report. And we're going to go into both these reports because it's very important that you understand what was put out and what they think actually happened versus the other facts that I don't want to say that all the research I've done has concluded that maybe they didn't look at all the facts. Maybe all the facts weren't taken into account, or maybe they just didn't want to take all the facts into account. So let's go into the FEMA investigation first because that one was done first. So I actually found this really cool website. It's called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. And I got a lot of this information off of there because it's all kind of compiled into one. And I got a lot of information for what the things that they left out also on that website. So I'm going to share a lot of information that I got from that website because these are people that literally have degrees. There are physicists, there are firefighters, there are, engineers and architects, obviously. A lot of people that came together on this website. It's a professional website, again, linked in the show notes. It's phenomenal information. So, this is a direct quote from that website. Quote, "The investigation was financed and given its authority by FEMA, with which lead investigator Gene Corley's team had a shaky relationship from the start. For months after 9/11, the investigators were unable to persuade FEMA to obtain basic data like detailed blueprints of the buildings that collapsed. Bureaucratic restrictions often kept the engineers from interviewing witnesses to the disaster, making forensic inspections at ground zero, or getting crucial information like recorded inspections at recorded distress calls from people trapped in the buildings. For reasons that would remain known only to FEMA, the agency refused to let the team appeal to the public for photographs and videos of the towers that could help with the investigation." So basically, FEMA's like, here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to give you all the money. We're going to create this team. You guys do this investigation. However, you're not going to get access to everything that you would need to do this investigation. So the city did decide to recycle the steel. And this is going to become a problem in both investigations. In the FEMA investigation and in the INST investigation. Investigators, families, and fire officials asked repeatedly to keep the steel for the investigation. However, by the time they had gotten access to the scrap yards, nearly all the steel was destroyed. So, cool. They were like, yeah, here you do have access to it. It's just, they gave us enough time to destroy it before you could actually see it. A lot of things were shipped overseas, completely just shipped away. They didn't even keep it here. And some things they did take to scrap yards around, and they had access to that. But this piece of the puzzle becomes quite the barrier I found in both the investigations. So FEMA's theory is the pancake theory. So basically, the jet fuel caused fires within the building, which we all know happened. We could see the fires. The impact from the plane caused the fire-resistant barriers that were attached to the steel columns and steel trusses to detach, meaning the steel was exposed. And then when one floor fell, it caused... So basically, the steel trusses are the floor beams, basically. And when the floor beam fell onto the next floor down, it was too heavy, and it caused... And the steel was exposed, so the fire was kind of making it more malleable, and it would fall, and cause a pancake effect basically all the way down. And the falling debris that was set on fire set at least 10 floors on fire in Building 7 and caused Building 7 to collapse later that day. That is basically FEMA's theory, is this pancake theory, that the floors fell, but I don't know. I don't want to start getting into it yet. I want to, but I don't. It just doesn't make sense. If the floors fell, then wouldn't the beams on the outside still be standing? So basically, the inside would have fallen, but the beams that go up and down to hold the building straight up would still be standing, right? Technically. Okay, we'll get into that. Here's the INST investigation. So the National Institute of Standards and Technology did an investigation. So they didn't think that FEMA was doing a great job on the investigation. I mean, do we think that either? So they decided that they would also do an investigation into what was going on in the buildings. So their investigation started in August of 2002 and was scheduled to take 24 months. It took a little bit longer than that. But in May of 2003, this was like their second, I don't want to say press conference, but their second release of information. And they put out 3 hypotheses at this release of information. So the first hypothesis was basically agreed with the FEMA floor collapsing pancake method. Basically, they're like, yeah, FEMA got it right. The second hypothesis, which is the one they will ultimately end up going with, is that the floor connections held strong, which caused, but the floors sagged, and that actually caused the beams on the outside to kind of sag inwards as well and basically buckle. But it's still the same theory that the fire retardantness, the fireproofing, was knocked off the beams to cause them to be exposed. And they would kind of bend inwards because the floors were holding on strong, but they were sagging because of the fire and because of, I don't know, all the stuff, which they're used to holding, I guess. They started to buckle a little bit. And then it was like a pancake method, except the outer beams are buckling instead of just the floors falling straight down. And then the number 3 hypothesis they came out with in May of 2003 was that the direct fire-induced column failure. So basically, like, the fire caused the columns just to fail. Period. End of story. In 2004, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, INST, put out another report containing other findings and working hypotheses. Although they didn't go into the 3 previous hypotheses or location as to where the initial failure started in either building. In 2005, September of 2005, so 4 years after the collapse of the buildings, INST released its final report that was called Probability Collapse Sequence. So basically what they said was that the impact of the planes severed many external columns and core columns in both buildings, and this caused the spray-on fireproofing to dislodge from the steel beams, which is all true. I don't know about the dislodging of the fireproofing, but it did sever multiple beams. I mean, there's literally a plane going into a building. Of course it's going to sever the beams. The floor trusses held strong, but the fire weakened the steel beams and caused them to basically pull inwards as the floors sagged. And then the exterior columns buckled under the sagging floor and fell inwards. Although also in their report, they put out that in World Trade Center Building 1, the south wall failed, and in Building 2, the east wall failed. But then they said that the top part of the buildings started to kind of lean towards whichever wall had failed, which makes sense again. And then it caused the downward movement. So basically all the weight from the towers caused a downward movement and caused it to collapse. Although, again, I'm debunking it as I know I'm not supposed to be doing this, but you know what? My podcast, I can do what I want. I just feel like the tops would have fallen off and then it would have stopped, or fallen enough that it would have stopped the whole, whatever. The INST produced very little evidence that the dislodging of the fireproofing had significant structural effects. And honestly, this is kind of a theme for them. I feel like a lot of the time they didn't produce enough evidence, and so they're like, listen to us, we know what we're doing. We're literally a national institute, right? So you should definitely listen to us because we know what we're talking about. However, we don't actually have to produce evidence. We're just going to tell you what we think happened. So the amount of dislodgement wouldn't have been visible from the outside. Obviously, everything's on fire. There's no way you could tell if the fireproofing had dislodged or what. So it basically had to just be estimated by the simulations they ran. So the simulations, they're like, we'll just guesstimate that all of it fell off. And that's what we'll go with. Because they don't really know. first of all, they don't know if the fireproofing actually dislodged at all. And it was sprayed on every couple years because that's like, part of the protocol. They have to keep respraying this fireproofing over and over and over. It's not like a one and done thing. It was done in the 70s and they never sprayed it again. No, they sprayed it all the time. And it was literally sprayed right onto the beams. It's like spraying insulation, basically, but fireproofing. They also ran a debris impact study to try to provide evidence of their fireproofing dislodgement and ended up basically disproving their findings. So they disproved themselves, but they didn't want you to know. So the study included shooting 15 rounds from a shotgun into a flat steel plate on a metal bar coated with fireproofing in a plywood box. So, referring to that experiment, Kevin Ryan writes, quote, "It's not hard to see that these tests actually disproved their findings. Nearly 100,000 blasts would have been needed based on INST's own damage estimates, and these would have to be directed in a very symmetrical fashion to strip the columns and floors from all sides. To put INST's pivotal claim to rest, there was simply no energy available to cause fireproofing loss. Previous calculations by engineers at MIT had shown that all the kinetic energy from the aircraft was consumed in breaking columns, crushing the floors, and destroying the aircraft itself. But INST's tests indicate that 1 MJ of energy was needed per square meter of surface area to shear the fireproofing off. The extra energy needed would be several times more than the amount of kinetic energy available to begin with." So they basically disproved themselves. However, a lot of people don't really read the findings. Some people do, but a lot of people don't. And so they just whatever was put out widely from news outlets, they listen to, but they don't actually read it themselves. So they don't actually go in and do all the research. But again, on this website where there's all these professionals that do this for a living, they know all the background, they know all these things. And I'm not an architect, I'm not an engineer. I did a little fire safety in the Navy, but I'm no expert. So it's nice to have these experts that literally put out a website about something like this. However, in World Trade Center number 1 and Building 1, this fireproofing theory couldn't have worked because the fireproofing dislodgement doesn't occur where the collapse started. The collapse of Tower 1 started on the 98th floor, and according to INST, there was no dislodgement of the core columns, or there was no dislodgement on the core columns on that floor, nor the floor trusses of the 99th floor. So it doesn't even make any sense. I'm just giving you the facts, folks. INST did receive about 236 pieces of steel to utilize in their investigation, and that's a decent amount. 236 pieces of steel. Out of 170 areas they tested, they found only 3 locations that bore any evidence that the steel had reached 250 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 482 degrees. Oh, excuse me. I'm reading it all backwards. 250 degrees Celsius or 482 degrees Fahrenheit. They also found no evidence of the steel ever reaching 600 degrees Celsius for any significant amount of time. And that's the temperature that it would need for the steel to become malleable, is 600 degrees Celsius. But it would have to be at 600 degrees Celsius for a significant amount of time for the steel to become malleable. It can't just flash up to 600 degrees Celsius and then go back, because that's not how it works. It has to be under that heat for a decent amount of time. INST therefore conceded, quote, "From the limited number of recovered structural steel elements, no conclusive evidence was found to indicate that pre-collapse fires were severe enough to have significant effect on the microstructure that would have resulted in weakening of the steel structure." Unquote. Of course, they conducted many simulations, computer simulations, with heating the steel up to 600 degrees Celsius, just to see what would happen, and then they put it out as evidence. but the evidence literally shows that the steel never reached that temperature for any significant amount of time. It might have reached that temperature at some point, but not long enough to make the steel malleable. Most of the investigations relied on computer modeling because most of the steel was destroyed, which, again, makes sense if you're going to try to recreate the situation, put it in a computer. But in these computer models, they didn't replicate the observed structural behavior of the buildings, and the models required quite a bit of intervention from the investigators to get the desired collapse. They applied information to the computer simulation that was known to not be factually accurate. It was factually inaccurate, but they put it in there anyway because they were trying to get their desired outcome, and they did. I mean, they absolutely succeeded in that, but it wasn't the right information. So that's what they put out to the public. They're like, hey, this is exactly what happened. Believe us because we're cool. And for the most part, the American people did. For the most part, the world did, honestly. But architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth in 2012 came out with, this was their official theory, and they came out with all this information about the FEMA and the INST investigations. That's where I got most of this information. So the buildings, this is all the information I got from them. They literally do this for a living. Like I said, I'm falling back on the experts here. The buildings were made to withstand hurricane force winds of up to 140 miles per hour. And a plane the size of a 707. I actually read somewhere else, or I heard somewhere else, that the winds could be up to 200 miles per hour. But we're going to go with 140 because, why not? And the difference between a 767, which is what hit the planes, and a 707 is about 40 passengers, or like 7-ish more rows of people. So not that big a difference. 40 more people. I mean, yes, 40 more people. But if you've ever been on an airplane, 7 rows is basically nothing. So the perimeter columns could have handled 5 times the load above them, and the core columns could have handled 3 times the load above them. David Childs, who is an architect, explained that never in the history of steel buildings had a steel building ever come down because of a fire. Other things, yes, but never because of a fire. The majority of the jet fuel also burned up basically instantly. So we see a huge fireball that comes, like when the plane first hit the building, you see this huge explosion. That's all the jet fuel burning off. And then all like the office furniture, carpet, things of that nature all started on fire because of this. So if you have ever lit like a campfire, a bonfire, any fire outside, even in your fireplace, if you've thrown a little bit of gasoline on it and you've lit if you light that fire like that, you'll see it all goes up in flames really big, but then what's left after that really big plume of fire is just a little bit of the material left on fire. Same idea. When the planes hit the building, all the jet fuel burned up instantly. Gone. Big fireball, left fires behind, definitely set things on fire. But the jet fuel didn't just puddle and burn. It burned off. Edward Muniak, who is a fire safety expert for organizations, cities, federal agencies, and insurers, said you can tell that the fires weren't that hot because the smoke was black, meaning that it was starved for oxygen. It was incomplete combustion. He refers to the statement above from the INST. So the INST put out a statement that said, and I kind of already quoted this earlier, quote, none of the recovered steel samples showed evidence of exposure to temperatures above 600 degrees Celsius for as long as 15 minutes, unquote. So jet fuel burns at 750 degrees Celsius, like flashpoint, and you could basically, Robert Podolsky said this. He said that jet fuel burns at 750 degrees Fahrenheit, and you can hold steel over 750 degrees forever and never make it soft enough to bend, let alone melt it. And he is a physicist and engineer, although that is not 100% accurate. Jet fuel does not, the flash point is pretty low, but it burns hotter. But again, it burned off instantly, so I feel like that's not even an argument. If it burns off right away, the jet fuel shouldn't have even been like a thing that's an option. So on September 19th, so just a couple days after this whole ordeal, Ronald Hamburger appeared in the Wall Street Journal, quoted saying, "It appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building," said Mr. Hamburger, chief structural engineer for ABS Consulting in Oakland, California. "Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, quote, I was very surprised," unquote, to all of it, basically. So, and then Hamburger actually became one of the team leads for the FEMA investigation later on. And he took back everything he said and was like, absolutely, there was no bomb detonation. But when you go back and you listen to a lot of the news that was put out basically right after 9/11, after everything, and you hear a lot of like first-hand retellings of this, and a lot of the news agencies putting out that it looked like a controlled demolition. It looked like there were bombs that went off. It looked like detonations. That there were different. It looked like it was controlled. Is basically what is put out. There are actually a lot of people, a lot of the first-hand experiences, the first responders, the people that were right there in it. They said that that they reported hearing a second explosion and or a lot of mini explosions. So it depends on like who you talk to. But somebody even said like it sounded like a bunch of gunfire, like pop, 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 pop. So I don't know. And when you slow it down, you watch it in slow motion. You can watch, and I have a video, and I've labeled it in our show notes. This is the slow motion video, so if you want to go watch it, at second 57 into this video, you can pause it, and you can literally see, like, windows exploding out below the collapse. So you can see the building collapsing, and about, I would say, maybe 10 stories below where the collapse is in its downward motion, you can see windows blowing out. Not all the windows for all those 10 stories, just about 10 stories below, you got one story of windows blowing out. And then a couple stories later, windows blowing out. And then a couple stories later, it looks like a controlled demolition. It looks like there were bombs being set off. CNN even said that the towers looked like it was a controlled demolition, like it had been planned well in advance. And it's weird that the first tower and the second tower fell in the exact same way. A CNN reporter actually said that. I don't know if it was the same day or very recently after the towers fell. You can also see at minute 3, 41 seconds, 3 minutes, 41 seconds into the video, you can see the other tower, and it's the same thing. You can watch the whole video is like just under 7 minutes. You can watch the whole thing, and you can see that there's literally windows blowing out and explosions. It looks like a controlled demolition. And that's one of the theories is that, and everybody says that this had to be a controlled demolition. They came straight down. Like I said earlier, when the tops have just fallen off, like it just didn't, some things are just not adding up. Also, that could account for why it fell at basically free fall speeds. They fell in 10 seconds. They fell quick. And that's not typically something that happens. These towers went down. But along those same lines, basically they were obliterated. There was nothing left. Everything was dust. You couldn't find a desk. You couldn't find a phone. You couldn't find anything. They did end up finding some shoes. They found a couple things, but they didn't really find very big pieces of anything. Everything was just basically pulverized. All the steel, like I said earlier, was shipped away and disposed of basically immediately, which these are all, I just wrote down a bunch of things that just seem super fishy, which is why there's a bunch of conspiracy theories about 9/11, right? So, also, along the same lines of not being able to find anything, riddle me this one, Batman. How come they couldn't find anything? They couldn't find an entire phone. They couldn't find a desk. They couldn't find anything put together. But a couple blocks away, they found Muhammad Atta's passport. Totally intact. Like it had never, nothing bad had ever happened to it. Like it was never even in a plane crash. It was a couple blocks away. They're chalking that up to it just flying away in the collapse of the buildings. It didn't have any fire damage. It had dust on it. But other than that, it was basically completely intact. So you're telling me you didn't find an entire anything put together besides one passport? They did find some shoes. They found some shoes that were fine, but I don't know. It's just little fishy. 2 years leading up to the attacks, NORAD had started conducting exercises using hijacked aircrafts as weapons. And one of those exercises actually did, one of the exercises was conducted about the World Trade Centers. Like, what if a plane hit the World Trade Centers? What if a plane was hijacked and was going into the World Trade Centers? NORAD was doing all kinds of exercises like this. In 1997, FEMA actually published their Emergency Response to Terrorism book, and on the cover was basically what looks like the Twin Towers with a crosshair over one of them. I don't want to speculate and say it's exactly the Twin Towers, although it does look exactly like the Twin Towers. Maybe they just based this cover roughly on the Twin Towers. I don't know. I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here. Operation Mascal in October of 2000 was a simulated plane crash into the Pentagon. And it was basically like a contingency exercise that simulated mass casualties of the Pentagon. So they had all these different, exercises. What would happen if? What would we do if? And they went through all these exercises, and that's not exactly how they responded. So these exercises maybe were, useless. But also, a couple of the theories that you come across is that either we knew what was going to happen, or we had proof that something was going to happen, and we just, people tried to tell us that something was going to happen, and we just ignored them. So, the FAA actually received 52 warnings about Al-Qaeda in the 6 months leading up to the attacks. 52 warnings. And at least 12 countries tried to warn the U.S. about an imminent attack on American soil. Along with all of these things, the hijackers were taking flying courses. There were rumors that they never finished them, so they didn't actually learn how to land the plane. But I can't find any evidence saying that specifically. That's just things that I've heard doing this research. And apparently they were taking courses with the U.S. military. Again, I don't know for sure, but there you go. Muhammad Atta, which was basically he was the lead hijacker, which he's the guy who we found the passport. He's also the guy that made the mistaken transmission to the tower instead of to the people on the plane. He was wired $100,000 from Pakistan, and there was never any inquiry into why a general from Pakistan's intelligence agency would be sending money to this guy who ended up being a hijacker. And on the morning of September 11th, government officials were having breakfast with General Ahmad in Washington. So there were government officials having breakfast with this general that sent the money to the hijacker of the plane, of the first plane. And the 9/11 Commission basically deemed the financing of the attacks was of little practical significance, which literally everyone knows that if you ever want to get to the bottom of anything, you follow the money trail. Every time. It doesn't matter. It could be a murder. It could be anything. You follow the money trail because the money never lies. People do basically everything in their life for money. So I watched the movie Zeitgeist. It was released in 2007, so it's a little old. And according to this movie, at least 7 of the hijackers are still alive, or were still alive in 2007. I don't know if they're currently still alive, but after all this, they were saying that hijackers were still alive, that they didn't even all die, which, if you ran planes into buildings, how did you not die? If you were on aircrafts that literally ran planes into buildings, how did you not die? Or into the ground, because, the people on Flight 93 ran that plane into the ground, but still. Seems a little fishy. I was nervous to report that one because I don't know. Again, I don't have evidence behind it. That's just the movie. And the movie's actually very informative. There's 3 parts. The second part is 9/11. The third part's really good too. So if you want to go watch that movie, there's a little plug for you. Bin Laden was actually one of America's most wanted criminals. No shit. However, in January of 2001, Bush ordered the FBI and other intelligence agencies to basically back off on the investigation into the Bin Laden family, even though two of his relatives were living in Virginia, very close to the CIA headquarters. Very close. Also, Osama bin Laden, I have to clarify because we are going to talk about his brother here in a minute. Osama bin Laden was allowed to seek treatment at an American hospital in Dubai and receive treatment from American doctors in this American hospital. Also, there's not a whole lot of proof that says that Osama bin Laden had anything to do with planning the attacks. And if we're going with the theory that there were, detonations or bombs placed to, blow up the building or take down the building the way it did, then it definitely had to have some pre-planning. There's no proof that he actually was there to pre-plan it or did any pre-planning for it. He had apparently taken responsibility for the attacks on a tape that was found in Iraq, but the translations don't actually translate properly from Arabic to English saying that he is responsible. So whoever translated it said, yep, there he is. That was him taking responsibility for it. He said, I was responsible for, the attacks on the Twin Towers, the attacks on 9/11, the attacks on America. And then other translators from different universities got to listen to the tapes. And they're like, no, he never once said that. So either that person didn't understand Arabic very well, or they're just saying whatever the government wants the American people to believe. Which, you guys know I'm skeptical, so who knows. Osama's older brother hired a man in Texas to take care of all the family's investings and such. That man was a close, lifelong friend of Bush Jr. Bush Sr. had made many trips to Saudi Arabia in 1998 and in 2000 on behalf of the Carlyle Group. The Carlyle Group was having a meeting in Washington on the morning of 9/11 with Shafiq bin Laden, who is Osama's older brother. And the Carlyle Group, just so you know a little bit more about them, they are a multinational private equity, alternative asset management, and financial services corporation with links to the defense contractors. So it behooves them to go to war. Also, you remember Larry Silverstein from the very, very beginning of this episode who had taken out a 99-year lease on the two buildings? And he paid, $3.2 billion for this lease for 99 years, which he's an old man. He wouldn't even live for 99 years. Anyway, whatever. He got the lease for the buildings only 2 months before the attacks. So, of course, he went ahead and pulled out insurance because he just got a lease on these buildings. He better, get insurance. What if there's a fire? What if there's an earthquake? What if something crazy happens? Conveniently, this guy got terrorism insurance. I mean, did he know something was going to happen? He went so far as once these attacks happened, he actually took the insurance company to court saying that he deserved to be paid double because there were two attacks. So he was saying that, I guess I'm assuming that he took out one insurance policy on both buildings, on the Twin Towers together. And if there was one terrorist attack, he would get a payout. But because a plane hit each individual building, that's technically two terrorist attacks, so he should deserve double pay. And the courts ruled in his favor, and he got a payout of $4.5 billion. So that's $1.3 billion more than what he paid for his lease on these buildings. So, I don't know. I mean, money never lies. You always follow the money. But that also begs the question, did he know that an attack was coming? Did he have, foresight into knowing that something bad might happen and he needs terrorism insurance? This is also something that comes up over and over, that some people decided not to go to work. I read somewhere that it was Jews. Somebody told a bunch of Jews just don't go to work that day. And Larry Silverstein actually is a Jew himself. So was it something about the Jewish community? Maybe they knew not to go to work that day. How much notice, how much foresight was known? How many people knew that something bad was going to happen and told a bunch of people just, hey, don't go to work. Hey, don't get on that plane this morning. One thing that I didn't add in here, but I'm going to add it now because I just have this information in my head. When you look at pictures of the crash or of the collapse of Ground Zero after these buildings collapsed, you can see a steel beam. There's one picture in particular, and you can see a steel beam, and there's a couple of pictures that you can, but there's one I'm thinking of right in my head. And the steel beam is cut at a 45-degree angle. And if you know anything about controlled demolitions, you know that they cut several of the beams in 45-degree angles inward. That way that the building doesn't fall in any direction to hurt any buildings around them. So they will fall straight down. So they cut a few of the steel beams, and then they set the detonations. So when it goes off, the beams that are already cut, they guide the rest of the building inward to collapse straight down. You can Google images of the rubble of Ground Zero, of the collapse, and you will see these buildings. You will see the steel beams that are cut, and they're cut perfectly. There's not like jagged edge, anything. No, there's no mistake that those beams were cut. They didn't happen to fall and be in that direction. They were literally cut in that direction. I have heard the theory thermite, because thermite burns hot, and it will literally turn steel into molten steel, like liquid steel. And in some pictures, in some cases, you can see literally puddles of steel on the ground. So the theory is that the detonations were of thermite to cause the beams to liquidate, basically. And not all of it, that maybe just thermite was where the planes crashed into. I don't know. But I want to end this episode on the Twin Towers on this note. 2,763 people died in and around the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001. To include 343 firefighters and paramedics, 23 New York City police officers, and 37 Port Authority police officers. Somewhere between 50 to just over about 200 people either fell or jumped to their deaths because they honestly did not think they had any other options. There's a picture out there, it's called The Falling Man, and it's a man, he's perfectly vertical up and down, and actually Sir Elton John now owns the photo. But you can still find pictures of it on Google because it was in basically every news outlet the next day. And he's literally jumping. You can listen to phone calls. If you go to YouTube, you can YouTube phone calls of people calling their loved ones to tell them that they're about to jump out of a burning building because they don't see any other way out. So at the end of the day, this isn't just like an easy thing. This isn't just like, oh, conspiracy theories, that's something that crazy people make up. If our government really did have something to do with this, and they were responsible, and this doesn't even include United 93 and the Pentagon. If 2,763 people died just at the Twin Towers. 50 to about 200, depending on where you look, it was somewhere between 50 and 200 people that either fell or jumped to their deaths. This isn't something that is just a light thing. This isn't just a light thing. This isn't just fun. These are people's loved ones. These are people that went to work that day without even thinking that anything bad was going to happen. These are people that had no idea what they were in for. This does include the people that were on the planes that crashed into the towers. But that's a lot of innocent lives lost. It's a lot of people that just died that day. And still, I get teary-eyed when I watch the videos. I think I cried 2 or 3 times doing the research for just this part, and I haven't even gone to the other side to do the other part. But, like, this is a heavy, heavy topic. And it is, I guess maybe it's, I don't know, I don't want to call it my favorite conspiracy theory because there's just so much, like, heartache and heaviness around it, but also it's one that, like, that interests me quite a bit because there's just so much evidence that's pointing against the actual investigations that came out from INST and from FEMA. Like, those investigations didn't even touch the other evidence that you can see with your eyes when you watch these videos. You can see with your eyes when you look up the information. You can read about it. This is a hard topic to cover, but I think it's really important that we get into the actual evidence behind it and not just what's been put out there from the government for us to believe. So, anyway, my friends, stay skeptical as always, and I will see you next week. The Rabbit Hole is an independent podcast with everything you hear done by me, Dani Mercy. We thrive on listeners like you. If you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating or review wherever you're listening. Follow us on Instagram at rabbit.holepodcast. Special thank you to Zakar Valaha Music for our intro.